having me. I always find the people of South Africa to be very cordial, and I truly appreciate that, and I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I love the cattle business. I have been around this business all of my life, which is to say that I've been here enough years that I've seen this industry change, no matter where we are, in the type of cattle that we feed, the way that we handle cattle, the way that we respond to consumer demands. But I've never seen a time in history of this business where we are undergoing more rapid and dynamic change around the world. Sorry, I got to figure this computer out. Yep. Here we go. This quote from Alice in Wonderland makes me think that Mr. Lewis Carroll must have been in the cattle business, or he at least had some friends that were cattlemen. Because the questions are where we're going and how do we get there, and I don't know and I don't care. They face the cattlemen today and maybe more so than we ever have. This may be a comment on current American politics as well. Mr. Trump doesn't do anything quietly, if you've noticed. So let's talk a little bit about the global cattle population. We're 1 billion strong around the world right now. So if you put that in context, we have about one animal for every 7 people on the planet today. So for the first time in world history, in one lifetime, which is my lifetime, the world population will triple. We will go from 3 billion people to 9 billion people by the time I expire or shortly thereafter. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the cattle that we have today will not feed the world in 2050. We've got to have more cattle. We've got to have more cattle producers around the world to feed these people. So when we look at the world population of animals, Brazil, the U.S., Argentina, and the Trans-Pacific et al. Constitute a lot of the large population cattle producers in the world and the export market of the world. India we separate because while they do have a lot of cattle, it's a completely different type of market. So when we look at the export around the world, you can see that Brazil is our leading exporter. India exports, that's a low quality meat. Australia is interesting because Australia, relatively speaking, against the large exporters, doesn't have nearly as many animals, but they're all in on the export market. You see where the United States stands, and you see where your own country, South Africa, is in the top 20 exporters of the world. So what are the top import countries of the world? So oddly, you would think, the United States is also the top importer in the world of beef. There's a reason for that, which I'm sure you probably know, but we'll talk a little bit more about later. But some of our biggest trading partners and the world's trading partners are Japan, China, South Korea, the Asian countries. Europe imports a lot of meat, but the Asian market is clearly the great importer of red meat. But that competition is extremely fierce. To give you an example, some of you will remember when we had a BSE scare with cattle in Canada. Well, the United States acts as the de facto export funnel for, generally speaking, for Canada and Mexico. And when that BSE positive was announced, the United States lost $1 billion in export business literally overnight. You could see it in the trade numbers. It was right there. A lot of that was in the Japanese trade. So nobody feels sorry for you in the export business. I mean, if you stumble, they're going to swoop in and take your business from you. And let's look at Australia as an example. Even in a country where they have devoted so much of their resource to export, if you look at yearly trends over time, and these numbers are somewhat difficult for you to see, I'm sure, but you'll notice from 2012 to 2016, they really did not grow to any great extent in their export business as a percentage basis. It's very, very difficult to gain ground in the export business because of that competition, and everyone stumbles, right? And then you also face some of the import requirements of countries like China, and which is in and of itself is quite a riddle. Keep an eye on these New Zealanders. You know, they've kind of made a world statement that they're going to get into this export business. we're probably going to see them rise in the export business on the dairy side. They've got quite a dairy industry down there, but they've got a lot of cattle in that country, a lot of beef cattle in that country. And they've done a good job of creating an island economy down there, and as a net export nation, they know how to do it. So keep an eye on them in the future. So why are we talking today about the export markets? Well, because the export markets in today's world affect the way that we produce cattle locally. Okay? Now that may seem like a simplistic statement, but when you have cattle in one feed yard that you're producing for, say, export to China, and then you have your domestic cattle, at some point you have to look at it and go, which one am I going to do, or which technologies am I going to transfer between groups that I can use? Okay? So we see techniques affected and practices affected quite clearly by the export requirements. So I'd like to talk about 5 trends that I see around the world, and certainly ones that we deal with in the North American market on a daily basis. That's not to suggest there are only 5 trends in the world, but these are ones that I think are critically important to our industry. As I said, we have an increased competitive export market. If you want to play in this game, it's going to be a difficult business. Okay? You found out in January how quickly things change, right, in the export business. We have the usual suspects. I said we have New Zealand, but what about the Chinese? That's always the big question in the last decade, right? What about the Chinese? The United States, as you know, has an ongoing tariff battle with the Chinese. It has nothing to do with quality of meat. It has nothing to do with how we produce anything, whatever. It's all about tariff. Well, while we're engaged in a tariff battle over meat with China, you think the other people are not sweeping in and taking business? Yeah, it's a huge market. But you always have to keep in mind that the Chinese don't have all the answers, and they have their own internal battles that they have to face every day. Let's take African swine fever as an example. It's created chaos within the borders of their country, and certainly in export and import markets. Even in travel, it's affected travel around the world. There's an embargo in some areas where we cannot travel because of African swine fever, and it's so deadly to swine, we can't take the chance of bringing it around the world. Meat quality. Beef grades are at an all-time high. You see it in your country, we see it in our country. We see it in Brazil, we see it in Australia. And that's a consequence of consumer demand. Okay? In the U.S., we're talking about phasing out what we call our select grade, which is our 3rd grade level of meat, and only having prime and choice. Because our feedlots in the United States right now are producing about 90% choice and about the rest is prime. It's very difficult for us to produce select grade meat today. And that's why you see the import number that we have of $5 billion. We're importing lower quality meat so that we can mix it hamburger and so on and so forth. And a lot of that comes from Brazil, by the way. An increase in carcass value. The export market, without a doubt, increases the carcass value beyond your local price. The Meat Board of the United States tells us that we have a $300 premium above local pricing when we export carcass. Okay? That helps us sustain our local prices, but the challenge that we face is that it costs about, the research is pretty clear on this, it costs us about as much to produce the export animal to equal that $300. Our cost is about the same. There's not a lot of added profit in that. We only are profiting from our local value that's underneath the $300. Okay? There's a reduced use of feed-grade antibiotics around the world, and I don't see that going away. The only thing that I could possibly imagine where that might change is if the world population gets to a point where we can't feed them adequately, and we have to use techniques that we've used previously, in this case would be feed-grade antibiotics and so on and so forth. I can tell you that feed-grade antibiotics in the United States are under great pressure, and we've instituted a policy there known as the Veterinary Feed Directive. And the Veterinary Feed Directive simply says that in order to use a feed-grade antibiotic, you must have the approval of a veterinarian. That has not been the case in the past. So what that means is that the veterinarian is now involved in what has traditionally been a nutritionist decision, okay? So now we have this overlap of these two consulting industries, and the question becomes, if I see a reduced use of feed-grade antibiotics, will I see an increase in the rise of injectables? Well, I can tell you the answer to that question in the United States is yes. Okay, now that the veterinarians are involved, we see a greater use of injectable antibiotics as this feed grade goes down. So I'm not sure that we've actually reduced our use of antibiotics as a whole, but certainly feed grade we have. Technology developments. There are some things that are being developed today that are beyond our imagination 20 years ago. One is the CRISPR technology, and I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it revolves around gene editing. And I was in a lab at Colorado State University recently, and I watched two graduate students in a CRISPR facility removing genes from E. coli and instantly killing the E. coli. Now, that's a fascinating science, and we'll have to figure out how to use it, but it's not going away. I can assure you of that, because it's going to be a disease control or disease eradication technology in the future. I also saw in that same facility a piece of equipment that uses electrostatic charge to increase the efficiency of spray rinse at an abattoir by 7 or 8 times. And the belief is that with the use of this equipment, they will be able to concentrate the spray itself and still use it at a reduced cost with this type of equipment. It's quite fascinating, these things. And these things come fast, and they will be adapted equally as fast, I believe. All right, so how's the industry? Those are the trends, some of the trends of the world. How's the industry addressing those trends? Well, there's more players in the market today in the competitive export market, but it is no longer simply a price market. The world is demanding quality, and that's why quality has gone up. Record keeping is more important today than it has ever been. We've got to be able to trace cattle. We've got to be able to trace what we did with these cattle, where they came from, so on and so forth. And that quality is going to be a paramount piece of the export market over time. And certainly you know this from your local market as well. So when it comes to meat quality, we thought we knew what quality was 15 years ago. We thought we knew what quality was 30 years ago, but the standard of quality continues to evolve and change. As I said, in the United States, we are now at a 90% choice market. We have too much choice meat, quite honestly. And the rest is prime. It's difficult for us, as I'm sure it is difficult for you, to produce a lower quality meat anymore, because our genetics have changed, our practices have changed, our rations have changed. All of these things have evolved through over the past few decades. An increase in carcass value. All right, as I said, today it costs about that same amount of money to produce these animals as it does in the additional value that you get. And the research has been fairly clear on that. But the beef exports just from the United States alone, and you can then say probably most of North America, will exceed $8 billion this year. So it's obviously a market that we want to play in. It is a market where we want to find additional profitability if we can, but we've got to determine how to produce the cattle that meet export requirements at a reduced cost. Okay? That means the adaptation of new technologies and new techniques. Okay? And I can tell you that so I work with the top 30 corporate feedlot organizations in the United States. And I can tell you that they don't traditionally ask, what do we need to do? They ask, how do we do it? They know what they need to do. You know what you need to do. It's simply learning how to do the next steps, right? The reduced use of feed-grade antibiotics. This question is probably one of the most complex questions that we have to answer over the coming years. How do we do that? How do we live without the tools of the past? Tylosin will probably go away in the United States at some time in the not-too-distant future. That's been a fantastic product for us in the battle against liver abscess. There is no rational, good alternative to tylosin today. So what do we do when it's gone? Because when it's gone, it will go overnight. So what do we do about that? What do we do about the animals that get sick? What do we do about preventative medicine in the future without the use of antibiotics? And it doesn't matter whether you use them on a specific treatment basis, whether you use it on a metaphylaxis basis, it doesn't matter how you use it. You've got to answer this question. Okay, so we have to, so now the conversation turns, and you've all been exposed to this. Can we find different methodologies, different metabolic pathways and whatnot to do the same thing that we did before? DeWald made the point of cooperation together. Well, I think that not only from the feeding standpoint is that a necessity, but I think what you will see is some level of that happening among manufacturing vendors, because there probably is not a silver bullet out there. Okay, it's probably going to be a combination of technologies that we have to use in order to get to the points we want to be in the future. Okay, we also will have to consider the efficacy of vaccines. The use of vaccines is paramount in our business, right? But the proper use of vaccines is even more important. And as we go forward, if there's more pressure on vaccine usage in the future, in other words, we're going to use more vaccines, then we have to worry about and concern ourselves with the efficacy of those vaccines. And can we improve that with the use of some of these new companion products? And those would be nutrition-based, let's say. Okay? Now, everyone has heard the term gut health. It is a ubiquitous, almost amorphous blob of a term. What does it mean? Okay, well, different people have different definitions for gut health, but I can tell you quite clearly it is not going away. It will drive research dollars in the future, probably to the point where other research is left undone. Technology developments. Well, we talked about the CRISPR technology. We talked about this new spray-rinse technology. But those technologies are going to be, the spray technology is easy, okay? Things like CRISPR are a bit difficult. How do we commercialize that type of technology, and how do we do it in such a way that the cost is reasonable and works in our situation? Those are questions that are in development. I think it's going to take a while to answer some of those questions, but again, this technology is not going to go away. All right, so as I was reading some of the recent publications from South Africa about this, about your business and some of the things you've undergone and the numbers and so on and so forth, I was trying to refamiliarize myself with your market from 5 or 6 years ago. And it occurred to me, I wonder if when we look at it, because quite honestly, no matter where I've gone in this world, every cattleman I've met is the same type. Okay, an independent and a hardy breed of people. Okay, it's the U.S., it's Brazil, it's South Africa, it's Australia, it doesn't matter. Cattlemen are all the same. Okay, but are we in the same business? As you would guess, yes and no. Both markets operated generally on a free market economy, although I question that sometimes in the U.S. But our cattle finishing weights are drastically different. We are finishing completely different animals. In the U.S., we are now finishing animals at somewhere around 600 or slightly more kilos. Our investment in these animals is somewhere around $1,550 US. So you don't, late deads are, or the worst nightmare in a feedlot in the United States right now. And about 73 or 74% of our input cost is in the feeder itself. Our domestic market qualities differ, okay? No question. The quality, the market in South Africa demands a completely different thing than the market in the United States, and for that matter in Canada and Mexico. We both import beef, oddly. We produce enough beef to feed our people, but we have to import beef because we can't produce certain things that our people like to eat, okay? I would say, and this, you may disagree with this, but I would say that export markets likely affect North America more so than they do the Republic of South Africa, not in that you can buy and sell, it affects buy-sell any different, but our production techniques are affected maybe at a higher rate simply because a great percentage of our cattle, or a significant percentage of our cattle, are in the export business today. Drought is a good thing. Boy, no cattleman would ever agree with that statement. But let me assure you that the data suggests otherwise. And if you looked at the data of the last sustained drought in the United States, you would see that we had a reduction, and you looked at the data and you say, okay, we reduced our total animal herd by about 3 million head. We went from 92 million to about 89 million, or even slightly less. Okay? Well, at the time that that happened, our economy was in a recovery phase, and so the demand for red meat was going up. We were going down in supply, going up in demand. What happens? Price rises. Rose to historical, almost insane high levels. And so what happens then? You quickly repopulate. Oh, this is great business, I'm going to repopulate. Well, oddly, and in something I never anticipated happening is, even as we repopulated, we sustained historically high prices. Now, they've come down some, but they are still historically high, and a lot of that has to do with the export market that we've gained over time, and we continue to gain, right? So if you looked at the data over a period of time, even as far back as, say, 15, 16 years, there's no debate that the drought and how we respond to the drought has resulted in long-term sustained profitability in the feedlot business, and certainly in the feeder business, in the cow-calf end of our business. They have had the best 5 or 6 years they've ever had in their existence. And as I read some of the analyst reports out of South Africa and your recent drought challenges, I saw exactly some of the same trends in the analyst report as I saw in the United States. Now, I think pricing was halted by the foot and mouth positive recently, but that may be a short-term effect. You know, we'll have to wait and see. But it looked like to me that the data would suggest that we saw rising cow prices, we saw rising prices based on demand. And so what I hope is that once you get past this little bump in the road, that you experience exactly the same thing we've experienced in the United States. So the company that I work for is a research and development company, and we produce all type of natural, so-called natural products, okay? And they're all nutritionally based for the most part. So when we look, and there's a lot of suppliers in the room here, you know, Fibro and Zoetis and other great companies that do exactly the same thing. They look out, and I can assure you they're looking at 1 year, 3 year, 5 years. What are we going to do in that period of time, and where do we put our research dollars? Okay? So from our perspective, we look at the future as a cradle-to-carcass concept. In fact, it's probably not even cradle to carcass, it's probably prepartum to carcass, because we have to take into account the idea of passive immune transfer and the transition mother cow and her recovery, okay, and the early calf life, the prevention of scours and so on and so forth. How do we do that in the new world, if you will, right? And how do we help our cattle producers 365 days a year? And even if you don't concentrate solely on one animal for 365 days a year, you are concentrating on the production cycle, the production operation 365 days a year, and that may be calf development, it may be cow development, whatever the case may be. We believe that in the future, in order to realize the greatest economic return, we're going to have to look at a comprehensive approach of a 365-day program on these animals. All right, 20 years ago, I can assure you, if somebody stood up here and talked about probiotics, okay, there's half the room at least that would walk out of here thinking foo-foo dust, right? I mean, this stuff is, ooh, this is a flim-flam deal. But that was because the science behind them hadn't caught up. The science behind alternative technologies has advanced so much in the last 20 years and become so much more sophisticated that our understanding of that alternative world is much greater. And by understanding that world to a greater degree, we understand better the application of solutions. Okay? And that is going to be critical when you start to put new products into your facilities, that you understand the correct application of that product. We talked about gut health. So how do you define gut health? Well, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to maintain the tissue integrity at the gut level. Okay, and we believe that if we can do that, not only do we have the opportunity to enhance the animal's performance, but we also have a way to battle disease or pathogen challenge using new technologies, new ingredients in place of things that we may have used in the past. And in addition, we believe that we're going to find over the next decade, through research, things that the producer already knows. Okay, and what I mean is systemic disease, and let's take BRD, for instance. Okay, we believe that there is a gut-level attachment to BRD. It is not simply the stress level through the nose, through the mouth, through the dust, whatever. We believe that pathogens getting into the bloodstream through the gut negatively affect lungs, they negatively affect livers, so on and so forth. Now, it may be, you may go, well, yeah, duh. Well, research has never proven that. We've never proven those links, but we believe that's where research is going. And so when we look at how do we control BRD in the future, how do we control these things, we're going to have to be thinking about the gut level. In addition, for all companies, all manufacturing and research companies, we have to determine, we have a finite amount of research dollars, so we have to define where we're going to use our research money, and adding clarity to terms like gut health helps us do that. Quality and safety. There is no question that quality and safety is important not only from a human perspective, but from the animal perspective. And we believe, as I said, in the comprehensive approach, that starts at the beginning. You start with these animals with quality of what they take in when they're calves, the cows take in, whatever the case may be, and that would be forage quality, as you know. And you know that there's certain places in South Africa, certainly, and in our country as well, where humidity is extremely high, and so you see mold and mycotoxin growth in your forage, and you see quality becomes a very difficult thing. Feed quality. Feed is a significant vector for pathogen transport. Right? We're feeding our animals pathogens, if you will. And so we have to concentrate a great deal on feed quality as we go forward. And our company puts a lot of effort into these areas. In food quality, now this is an area where I believe that we still have a lot of catching up to do as an industry, because I think as we go forward, we're going to see a lot of pre-harvest intervention technologies come about that help our efforts at the abattoir to control pathogens on the hide and so on and so forth. So gut health. Well, some of the areas that we believe and our manufacturing industry believes are important to look at as we go forward would be, and all of them in some way, shape, or form are interlocked. Okay? Glucose metabolism, the control of cortisol response in the animal. We look at the use of active microbials, and active microbials, the word microbial, what is an antibiotic? Well, it's an antimicrobial, right? And so what we're doing here is we're trying to find ways to replace an antibiotic with a microbial compound, or a microbial spore, if you will. Okay? We're looking at energy substrates at the gut level, where we're providing energy in this part of the body, so that that energy is utilized by the animal in that area, and it also helps us maintain tissue integrity down there. Beta-glucans, that's an interesting deal, and you may have heard beta-glucans when people have talked about yeast cell wall derivatives and so on and so forth. Beta-glucans are substances which will initiate an immune response in the animal. Okay, so we're trying to manage immunology at this standpoint. Coccidiostats have been around a long time. I still think they're important because coccidiosis is still a gut-level damage disease. Essential oils and organic acids have gotten a lot of press, but these are, and I'm not an expert on organic acids and maybe not even on essential oils, but we still have a ways to go with these things. But we see derivatives from oregano and cinnamon and whatnot that certainly show some promise in our industry as alternatives, or pieces of an alternative, if you will, okay? And then encapsulation technologies. Well, any of you who have been around the dairy business know that the dairy business uses encapsulated amino acids and in some cases encapsulated choline and so on and so forth. And they use that as a ration balancing deal for amino acids for these high-producing, high-need dairy cows, okay? And that's cool and it's all okay. But when we start talking about the beef industry, the use of those kind of products becomes a more difficult equation because we simply do not have the measurements, the profitability measurements like they do in the dairy, and we don't have short-term measurements to know whether or not we're getting immediate response to this kind of nutrition. Furthermore, it's difficult for us on the beef side to balance for amino acids. We don't have a lot of tools to do that with today. Okay. However, it's not necessarily the amino acid itself that's of interest to me. What's of interest to me, and I think it will be of interest to the industry, is the encapsulation technology itself, because who's to say what we can and cannot encapsulate in the future? We may be able to encapsulate things in the future and deliver to the gut level that we can't today. And by delivering to the gut level at a very prescribed rate of delivery, then we know exactly what we're doing with the new technology that we want to apply to the animal. So hopefully we can get a greater effect from that technology than we would have had we just put it in, through the mouth. Okay, and I believe, as I said, there's going to be multiple encapsulation opportunities as we go forward. And quite honestly, what we find is that there are as many good ideas about what to do with these technologies or which ones to encapsulate or whatever that come from the industry as much as come from our own brain trust internally. So that cooperative effort between the two parties is going to be important. And I don't think you ever would be shy about this, but don't hesitate to give feedback to the people that come and call on you every day, right? So in summary, the great Bob Dylan told us, we are in a time of change, maybe unlike any our industry has ever faced. The export markets are having a significant impact on all local markets that tend to operate in the export market. I think it'll be very difficult for any cattle-producing country to live in an insular world, primarily because you cannot outrun the information highway. Your customers know what's going on in the world. They know about food concerns, they know about food myths, they know about all of these things, right? And so it's hard to close yourself off from what's going on in the world. We are learning a new approach in this industry. We are opening our minds to new technologies and new ways of doing business. And even the current quality means something different to us today than it did in the past. Will natural someday be normal? I don't know. I think it's hard to say. In the United States, we have about 5% of our market today is naturally produced animals. That has held a fairly steady number for the last few years. But again, if the world markets dictate and we can figure out how to produce the animal for the same cost as conventionally raised in a naturally based environment, I think it's the way it'll probably go. And I think everybody will probably go that way. Thank you for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions that you may have.
So how do you think we can, from Africa, really gain on that position?
So, if you've ever seen the Texas Hold'em poker, right, on TV, the guys eventually they go all in, right? They push all their chips in. Well, I think the United States has probably pushed all of its chips into Asia. Now, it's not to say that we don't export to Europe, of course, we do. But the Asian market is so fierce, so competitive, that I'm not sure anybody gets into that one real easy in the future. But I do believe that the European market, there will be some access to the European market as countries begin to look more towards Asia. And so with the historic connection to the European market, it may be that South Africa is able to play a little bit easier in that game. You know, the other thing too is I drive around. You know, we drove from Pretoria down here yesterday, and some around Pretoria, and I was very, very impressed with the amount of grass that I saw, the native grass. And I mean, it's as in the United States we would say it's stirrup high. In other words, it's rubbing the bottom of a stirrup of somebody on a saddle, right? I mean, it's extremely high, great forage, and I saw great looking crops on my way down here as well. And you know better than I do, but this looks like to me a country that could raise more cattle than it raises today. If you want to play in the export market, I think that's going to be a necessity. You've got to expand your business. It makes sense to kind of do that because you think about that 7 billion to 9 billion people over the next 30 years. If you want to be in business, you're going to have to expand. No place is getting smaller, and so I would think that given the resources that you have here, the quality of genetics that you have here, the quality of producers that you have here, you could probably stand more cattle in this country.
Thanks very much. Tim Noakes, I'm going to be speaking a bit later, but what I just wanted to point out to anyone who's interested, that the imports, I noticed the two countries with the greatest import of meat were Japan and Hong Kong, amongst the highest. Those are the two countries have the longest life expectancy in the world.
Yeah, good point.
So if anyone thinks that eating meat is killing you, you just have to look at that graph.